So anyway, the next customer I get is this guy who seems to be quite level-headed and all right. And when he gets in, he says, we're waiting for one more. And the girl comes in the car, and it's all right. And I say, well, we'll just take this street and that street and go straight up that way and so on and so on. He says, yep, sounds good to me. And then the girl says, after we drive a couple blocks, hey, you're a good cab driver, you go fast. I say, yeah, I'm not from around here. I'm from where people drive normal instead of dawdling around and fucking the dog. Where are you from, she asked me. I say, well, I'm from Montreal, where people get going instead of sitting there. She said, I almost got hit by a bus in Montreal. I said, yeah. If you behave like people do around here, you would. Where people around here, they just step out any old place and they jaywalk all over and, you know, the traffic actually stops for them. Whereas in Montreal, that kind of shit doesn't happen. They said, well, all you have to do is not put yourself in the path of a moving vehicle. You got to think a little bit. That's the way the rest of the world works. It's not la-la land like here. And she says, but it's our culture. I said, yeah, but how come it's only here? Then the guy chimed in and said, well, you know, in the rest of Canada, like, you know, back east to Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, Winnipeg, and in Europe, all over Europe, that's how people drive and that's how people walk. I said, thank you. She says, but you know, the Europeans came here, and how do you think the indigenous people were before the Europeans came here? I says, what has this got to do with indigenous people? Well, it's part of the culture. It's part of the indigenous culture. I said, well, what does indigenous people have to do with jaywalking? There were no cars when there were only indigenous people here. Anyway, it got into a thing about jaywalking and indigenous people. And then I said, how come everyone today has to argue with me? Why? She says, I'm not arguing, we're discussing. I said, we're discussing, but I can tell from your tone that you're disapproving and disagreeing with everything I'm saying. And I said, I'm not going to convince you, and you're not going to convince me. So why can't we just leave it at that? Well, that shut her up. And he was thankful. And he was generous. He gave me a good tip. But it was 3 in a row. And then the next fare was the second half of those guys who wanted to go to McDonald's and me lend them some money. That was really funny. I ended up ranting this whole thing to them. Whee! I love doing that in the rain. So much fun. Rear wheel drive rules, okay? And they got in, and I was ranting this whole story and about their friends and buddies and everything else. And they loved it. I think one of them recorded me on a iPhone. Can you record people's voice on an iPhone? I wouldn't even know. I could record them with a camera. I could put this camera in my pocket and, you know, press record, and it would record the inside of my pocket and the sound, and maybe perhaps my heartbeat. But I'm digressing. I can see by the gauge on the dashboard that I am nearly out of fuel. So I should actually get some gas. I'll get gassed up. Yes, I will. Just gotta wait for the traffic light. Oh, fuck. This is gonna take forever. This is gonna take for fucking ever. Well, you can tell we're having a beautiful morning this morning. I got no patience for that. I don't want to wait. We're pulling into a Petro-Canada. which only happens in Canada. Well, as they say, later.
Fetwick.
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 Fetwick.